just the further 16. Well, thank you, Jonathan. It was delightful to hear the first session today, hearing from Matt and others involved at the very high political level on the summit. For this session, we're going to look at global AI diplomacy. So we've heard from the political level. Now we're going to hear from the civil service, working level diplomats, and other members of civil society who are also working on the issue of global AI policy. This summit has come at an extraordinary time. I've called it almost the autumn festival of AI diplomacy. So we just had these two meetings up at Bletchley Park over the course of this week. Next week in Paris, we have OECD meetings on AI. In December, we have GPAI, the Global Partnership on AI, meeting in Delhi in India for the very first time to talk about expert views on, and projects and applied work to try to solve and address and solve AI risks and AI safety problems. We also have an ongoing process within the G7 countries, the world's 7 biggest economies, to discuss principles and a code of conduct for AI safety. So it's a fascinating time, and for this audience here at the Fringe, we want to help put this in context. What does it mean to be doing AI diplomacy? What does the outcome of a summit like we've just had over the past 2 days at Bletchley Park, what does it really mean? One of the themes that is a common thing that I pick up on in my work is that it can often feel like global diplomacy around an urgent issue, like what to do about AI, can feel frustratingly slow. But I want to kind of unpack a little bit how diplomats look at the outcomes of this kind of summit. What does summitry really mean? So we're going to spend a bit of time on that. We're also going to talk about how different countries in different regions of the world bring different perspectives to what are the most important issues. So I hope you'll join me in welcoming our esteemed panelists today. As I said, my name is Kevin Allison. I work for Minerva Technology Policy Advisors. We're a geopolitical and technology policy consulting firm focused on AI. I've had the great pleasure to introduce to my immediate left Daniel Remler, who's the AI policy coordinator for the US State Department. Linda Bonyo, who is the CEO and founder of Lawyers Hub, an organization based in Kenya that works across the African continent on data privacy, digital policy, and AI issues. And then finally, Charlotte Watts, the Foreign, Commonwealth, and Development Office's lead scientific advisor. So we're going to spend some time with our guests picking apart some of these issues and trying to put global AI diplomacy in context. So please, big welcome for our panelists. So, Charlotte, I wanted to start with you.
Okay.
We've had 2 days of a summit that I think is fair to say exceeded expectations. Can you talk, again, from the perspective of a diplomat working on technology issues? What were the sort of big accomplishments of the summit? What were the key diplomatic deliverables or the outputs of the summit? Help us understand a little bit where they kind of rank, the sort of sequence they came out in, and what their significance is as kind of objects of global diplomacy. Can you just run us through, from your perspective, what we accomplished this week?
Okay, yeah, and I'll give you the top lines, and then we can get into other elements on the conversation. I mean, this was a big deal. This was a huge achievement. You said it exceeded expectations. Our expectations were high. We always aim high. And I mean, the thing that was really important about this meeting, it was the first AI summit, that it brought together 28 countries was really significant. You know, it wasn't a G77 conversation, a G20 conversation only. It was really trying to get that breadth of geographic participation. It had the US, EU, and China all talking about AI safety, for example. And the achievements, that there wasn't a consensus. There are clearly huge opportunities around AI, but also significant risks. And particularly when we think of the future generations and iterations of AI, the range of risks that we could face. And then lastly, the need for coordinated international action on frontier AI. in the systems where we face the biggest risks. That agreement was something that took a lot of conversation. When you're working up to a summit, you have a Sherpa with Jonathan Black, who was literally going from capital to capital, having the conversations, listening, understanding, really sort of thinking about actually where is there consensus, where do we need further conversations. So that statement, and I hope you've all looked at the Bletchley statement, is really important, and we're delighted that it was achieved. I think other big things clearly were the establishment of, by the UK and the US, of AI safety institutes. I think it was discussed in the last panel a little bit, a really important step forward to think about what are the practical ways governments can start think about looking at AI safety. I think there are also other very strong messages about the importance that benefits are shared widely, the importance of wider participation in AI, and then finally that it's an issue that governments need to engage in, private sector, the big tech companies and small tech companies to engage with, but also a really important role for civil society and communities as well. And then lastly, I think, this was the first summit. You were talking about the plethora of activities. That reflects the significance. So I'd be more worried if there wasn't lots of follow-up activities than that there were loads. And the key ones that were agreed was a 6-month follow-up in South Korea, and then a year's time, the follow-up in France, led by France.
Great. So Daniel, you spend your entire job just focused on global AI diplomacy. Help us put the summit that happened here in the UK this week in that global context. Where does the Bletchley Park discussion fit into this bigger conversation that I think it's worth pointing out has been going on for some time? Help us just understand the landscape of all these different events and tracks that are going on now diplomatically.
Well, you've stolen my thunder, Kevin, a little bit, because I was going to say that this conversation has been going on for a while. And that's important to note, because that is the context in which the UK summit happened. So the OECD, a group of mostly industrialized economies, has been working on AI for a long time. It set out the first set of intergovernmental principles on AI in 2018, as well as principles for different actors across the AI lifecycle. And the G20 adopted these principles, so you've already got a significant critical mass of states that agreed to a very basic set of broad AI principles. The UN has been working on AI for years. UNESCO had the recommendation on the ethics of AI in 2020. And the G7 even, though it made news this week with a code of conduct for developers of advanced AI systems, has been working on AI since 2016, also first begun under Japan's presidency back then. And there's many other initiatives. You mentioned the Global Partnership for AI. India is going to take over as chair. France and Canada both play prominent roles there. The role of GPAY, as it's known, is to push forward practical projects on AI and AI governance. So each of these initiatives have slightly overlapping but different areas of focus. And so anybody that works in AI diplomacy has to have some inherent skepticism of a new initiative. But the UK has clearly cleared that hurdle this year and demonstrated over the course of the last few days that the summit filled a niche that was missing. So the focus on the long-term risks of AI was significant and new, bringing together a diverse group of states as well as civil society and businesses represented at very, very high levels was quite impressive to me. And the fact that France and South Korea have lined up as the next hosts, as Charlotte said, I think demonstrates the long-term commitment of different states to doing this. And the United States worked very closely with the UK government to make this year a success, and will continue to work with France and Korea to make the next installments a success. So you have these different pieces of the AI diplomatic landscape fitting together this year, and now we can start to take steps to really take more concrete action.
Okay, Linda.
Yes.
I want to ask you about your work in a kind of pan-African context and how countries on the African continent are looking at this set of AI issues. But before we do that, so Charlotte and Daniel are diplomats. You work in a civil society context. Can you just spend a few minutes just telling us a little bit about your work and the types of organizations and the governments that you're speaking to, and what you're doing to kind of help work on these data, privacy, and AI issues?
Thanks so much, Kevin. I would want to say that maybe first of all, Africa has been mentioned twice by yourself. And a lot of the talk has been the US, China, now the UK, as well as what Europe is doing. And I think that's really unfortunate for the world, in every single, aspect of it. At the Lawyers Hub, we've been working to bring together different digital policy players to talk about the concerns of the African continent and how that fits in with the global conversations. So 3 years ago, we did an AI policy conference that brought together 2,500 lawyers and technologists from across Africa. And I think that was the first, because I think that the world focuses, and we've seen this from colonization, that, in my village, they come and say, we discovered, I was the first to see, river, wherever. Myself, I'm the first from my village to see River Thames. But it's not true. There's things happening in the world, but I don't think that the way the current media and political structure is does not actually give opportunity for Africa to have those conversations, or even to have, to be noticed for those conversations. I also think that there's a presumption that involving involving India in the room means that you have the global South with you. And maybe the structures and groupings are broken because then they are not representative of who we are. We had a discussion, I think, from the panel on Monday. We had a discussion outside, and a friend from Brazil told me, how is Brazil and Africa the same place as the global South? Like, we have such different concerns and needs, and how do they just lump us into one corner? When I'm in Europe and I'm in the US, it looks really similar. It may feel homogeneous, but that's not the truth about all these other parts of the world. And I think we need to recognize that. One of the successes of, I think, India with G20 is on really bringing to fore the conversation on digital public infrastructure and saying that the struggles that you have around having the latest iPhone is not the same as the struggles that we have where we come from. We're struggling with digitization. We're struggling with actually what belongs to in private hands, and this we're seeing with AI, that is a lot in the private hands and private companies, and not in the hands of government. And so government is trying to play catch up. But we have been trying to play catch up with the rest of the world for such a long time. I also just want to follow up on the conversation on what's happening in Africa, And so we've had discussions on how do you further AI, especially on AI policy within the African continent, not even about AI innovations and how to build innovations in that particular context. So the African Union has been working on an AI strategy for the continent for the past 2 years. And I've been on the panel representing the United Nations on that. They've made progress led by Egypt to get a continental strategy. And hopefully in February, from the conversation that's coming out, they'll be able to adopt that at the African Union level. But then we have different countries like Egypt, Rwanda, and Ghana that have come up with national AI strategies. And we see that the jump towards having laws. This week we had a draft AI and robotics law coming from Kenya, which is a private member's bill and not necessarily the government position. But we've seen the build-up in terms of Kenya coming in and saying, we need to have an assessment of what's in the sector, which was done in 2019, and then figure out what takes us to the next point. But I also want to say that we are seeing a serious capacity gap in terms of engagement. And the same sort of concerns we've been having around how do we participate? And today, I'm glad to be on this panel, but I'm really saddened that many civil society groups, including those in the UK, were not able to attend this particular conference. And so it becomes an echo chamber of similar voices, just speaking to each other, but not really hearing the diversity of experiences that we have outside there. And also the UN I think the UN Secretary General announced the Global Advisory Body on AI. It's so unfortunate that there's no single African civil society represented in that particular body. And we assume that because someone is black and they're based in Australia, that they represent Africa. I think the way we measure success in this current world is broken and something needs to be fixed.
You've raised a whole lot of fascinating points there, and I want to unpack some of this. So first, just on the idea of the Global South being this construct and even Africa, really, it almost makes no sense to even talk about Africa as a singular entity. It's many countries with many different perspectives. From your perspective and from your experience with the governments and other organizations that you've worked with, how does the people that you have experience helping on these issues, how are they looking at AI safety and AI risk versus just access to digital tools, including AI, to accomplish economic growth objectives? Because that is a tension in the global debate. It's these different countries or groups of countries or regions are taking different perspectives on what the urgent issues around AI are, and that complicates the global diplomacy on this. So I'd really value hearing your perspective on that from the work that you've done and the experience that you've had.
Thank you. So we've been trying to set up capacity building programs for the judiciary, for members of parliament across Africa who are lawyers. And one of the days that I was training about artificial intelligence, I spoke about AI. From the beginning, I kept saying AI, AI, AI. And then at the end, somebody came and he raised his hand and said, you know, Linda, the entire time you talked about AI, I just knew you were talking about artificial insemination. And I said, oh my God. Then I told him, actually, it's the same concept. But it tells you that the world is not the same. And the challenges that we have with our policymakers is not the same. Yeah. And so when we talk about AI in Africa, it's just in pockets, bits and pieces where people are talking about these conversations, but it's not a mainstream conversation. We've seen, you know, for instance, if you look at the elections that have happened in Africa, in Kenya in 2013, about disinformation, really people don't tie down the issue to what my newsfeed shows me and what AI can do in that sense. So we don't have that correlation in terms of what's happening. I also think that Africa is not represented at these global convenings because the same conversations on government to government is following the same institutions. So for instance, you want the Ministry of Trade to negotiate on data flows. We'll definitely negotiate with the other Ministry of Trade. But then we don't see that these skill sets don't exist in these institutions. And there's a sort of a tussle on how do you rework institutions that represent us in a way that they actually have the capacity to do it. And two, we don't negotiate things and don't talk about issues unless they're funded. For instance, Kenya's budget, education budget, is funded by, I think almost 70% is funded by Britain. And so what you want in our education sector is what we will have. You know, if you pay for it, we'll have it on the menu. And so I think that until AI is funded in Africa, you're not going to see it take center stage. And what does funding look like? And I'm glad that this week the AI for Development Fund was announced, you know, a collaboration, I think, of Canada, the UK, the US. That's really commendable. But the problem with funding, like lawyers have, we do amazing work. But it's interesting how people still want you to defend the work that you do on global stages because it's not written in their language, it's not reflective of who they are. And so we have funding going back to the same white people, unfortunately, who work in Africa and does not go into black pockets. That's unfortunate.
Charlotte, let me bring you in because I know that the capacity building has been a part, as Linda said, of some of the summit outcomes. So can you provide us some additional context and maybe responding to what Linda's been saying?
Yeah, sure. And I mean, I think you're making a load of really important points. I mean, my teams were working very heavily behind the scenes to talk with the USAID, with Canadians, with partners across a number of African countries, including sort of going to the Rwanda meeting, to Kenya and so on, to think about, very, very cognizant of that big risk of we haven't got the breadth of engagement around the world, that you have, at one level, in a number of African countries, really exciting AI innovators, small businesses coming up, but also gaps, right? And a need for capability to continue to create opportunities for people to make careers, make businesses in AI. Recognition also of the strength of universities, but there's more that could be done in universities on AI. And also the challenge of policymaking and how do you think about Africa as part of, you know, shaping their own decision-making about AI, just how do you make sure that they are, you know, have the right opportunities to learn and to be at the table, both domestically, regionally, and globally. So the AI for development is really trying to bring resources around that. It's been listening through the conversations across Africa about what is needed And what, as a collection of donors, what we've tried to do is say, rather than do little bits and pieces all over the place, let's come together, let's pull together serious resources to fund a range of streams around capacity building, around policymakers' capability, around supporting institutes that can lead on AI, that can bring civil society groups into the fore as well, to try and respond to those issues that you're talking about. And I mean, it's ourselves, it's USAID, it's Gates Foundation. It's a number of the tech companies are also signed up. And if anything, we're welcoming others to come on board, because for us, one of the risks is that AI is done to Africa, that sort of applications that are being developed on completely different continents are then being used and deployed, versus how do we ensure that AI is being generated by Africa for Africa.
Daniel, capacity building is one of these terms that gets thrown around in global diplomacy a lot. It's one of those terms that kind of makes my eyes glaze over, along with stakeholder engagement being another one. What it really means is we need people who understand the tech and understand the politics and can talk to people from different countries about it, right? And it's not a problem only in global South countries or across Africa. It's a problem everywhere. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the challenge of getting the capacity within both the State Department, but more broadly within government, within regulatory bodies, to tackle these AI problems. Because to get AI safety that allows us to deliver AI benefits, we've got to get policy right, and that has a huge capacity problem across for governments around the world. So from your perspective, working at state on these issues, what do you see as the big challenges, and what is the US government doing about that problem in the US context?
Well, it's a profound challenge, Kevin. I mean, the UK is standing up a new institution, the AI Safety Institute, after you already stood up ARIA to do many of these kinds of tech-related innovation challenges as well. The United States is going to have to set up our own AI Safety Institute, so we're going to have to staff it up with real technical expertise, many of whom are not currently in government. In fact, probably the overwhelming majority of them are not currently in government, and we're going to have to train folks that are already in government on new kinds of skills and methods of evaluating these very advanced and capable AI systems. In the executive order that President Joe Biden announced on Monday, there's an entire section on attracting talent both from abroad to the United States, but also attracting talent into the US government, and then training our existing workforce on AI. And this is the State Department plays a unique role in the sense that we both, obviously we're an agency, and so we have to attract talent to work at the State Department and train talent, but we also are the interface with the world in terms of visas and visitors and educational exchange programs. And the executive order lays out an ambitious array of tasks for us to streamline the visa process, to improve the H-1B visa process, J-1, all of these acronyms that are essential for the United States to be able to attract talent from around the world and to ensure that that our AI innovation ecosystem is continuing to be at the forefront, but also that our government can attract the best and brightest from the United States and around the world. And as Kevin, as you mentioned, I mean, it's not a challenge just for an advanced economy. It's for economies all around the world to be able to do this effectively. And we're eager to partner with the UK through our AI Safety Institute on sharing talent, working together to understand how to do this more effectively so that our staff can be built up together, and to work with partners around the world, developed and developing countries, to make sure that this kind of capacity building continues. We have a small program at the United States, at the Department of State, called AI Connect, where we bring AI policymakers from around the world to bring them to fora like the OECD to be really at the forefront of AI technical policymaking, so that in particularly in developing countries where there aren't the kinds of connections between the OECD and those governments, they can learn those skills and be involved in a more inclusive way in the policymaking process. So this is a challenge we're all facing, we're all trying to tackle. But I think the executive order at least gives us an ambitious set of tasks and marching orders to fulfill that.
Maybe just a quick follow-up. So the technology industry and civil society, like Linda mentioned, are other key players in this discussion. And so how is the State Department interfacing with both of those camps as it works, at a global level with other countries as well?
Yeah, this is essential. I mean, with the code of conduct announced by the G7 on Monday, we did something very unique, totally unique in the context of G7 digital policy, as far as I'm aware of, which is that we actually released a draft version of the guiding principles weeks ago at the UN Internet Governance Forum, which has a quite inclusive array of multi-stakeholders coming to it, and then we put that on our website, solicited input from civil society, from industry, from partner governments outside the G7. The European Commission did the same. I believe the Japanese government did the same. And that's highly unusual. I don't think the G7 really does that as a matter of course of putting out a draft document for public input, but we recognize that this was essential to get it right, both at the technical level, but also to grant our ultimate product a degree of needed legitimacy. And it's the reason why actually we called the Code of Conduct an international Code of Conduct, right? Not the G7 Code of Conduct, because we think that the technical criteria in there, the statement of values for democratic values and human rights, are applicable to countries all around the world. So that was essential, and I think that was a very innovative approach by the G7 to that product. And it's something that we're hoping to bring to other aspects of our AI diplomacy, working very closely with industry, both obviously large incumbents, but startups as well, civil society in the United States and in partner countries, and then with a broad, diverse array of foreign partners. And we're trying to bring AI into all of our bilateral and multilateral engagements, no matter what country it is, really.
Charlotte, I want to come back to the summit itself, and I want to talk about how diplomacy on really tough science and technology issues works. With my experience following cyber diplomacy, it moves so slowly. And the outcomes, there's clear outcomes of this summit this week in the UK. There's been a lot of announcements. The question that skeptics will pose is, isn't it all just talk? What's the real value of this? And when we were getting ready for this panel, we talked about how to think about summits as not just the meetings themselves, but all the work that goes into it and the sort of what comes after. Can you help us unpack that a little bit? Like, what is the actual real value of a summit like this beyond just the meetings and the outputs themselves?
Yeah, no, very happy. I mean, I'm a scientist, right? So I'm seconded into government as the chief scientist. I've been in government now for a few years. And that was one of the things that I only really understood once I'm in the inside, is just when it's the same with the COP meetings or other big global meetings. These basically provide these, in some respects, a deadline, right? Where you go, actually, we are going to come together. We want to achieve, we have an ambition of what we want to achieve. And then there's just a massive amount of legwork of diplomatic activity then to get and to maximize that chance of having really a successful agreement on something that will move the issue that you care about forward, right? AI safety. And so as I mentioned before, we had Jonathan Black, the Sherpa, going around all of our embassies, are talking to their counterparts in governments, really trying to work out, okay, what is your view, sort of working on that consensus and trying to get alignment on, the scale of the risks that we're talking about. What are the other issues that maybe need to be surfaced and brought to the table as part of this summit? So, and what you've also seen is a number of announcements. So the AI Institutes, the AI for Development, again, they're all parallel streams of work that have taken a lot of consultation, diplomatic activity, mobilization of resource, discussions with our Prime Minister, our ministers to say, actually, are you happy? Is this what we're going to do? Is this where we're going to put significant effort? So you see that summary, it's easy to underestimate. That is such a big step forward, and there's a huge amount of work to make it to that point. So that's why we're delighted, and we wanted it to be something significant. So that's why I said this was what the goal that we set ourselves. I think we're really delighted too that we've got the 2 follow-ons, because the risk is there's a big event, and clearly we don't have all the answers. This is a hugely complex and changing area, so that we've got in relatively short succession the Korea and France follow-up summits, I think, will be the way, essentially the way we're trying to ensure this is something that's going to be long-lived and there's continued momentum on it.
One interesting anecdote on this is another diplomatic tech policy issue that I follow are discussions between the US and the European Union on a whole range of technology issues. And the US and EU launched this Trade and Technology Council a couple of years ago. I think we're on our 6th meeting now. One of the things that came out of that, they'd had the first meeting, and then we suddenly had the situation with Russia invading Ukraine. And what folks who were involved in some of those discussions bilaterally between the US and EU told me was that just having had the summit to, all of the work that went into the communique, all of the work that went into, like you said, the summit Sherpas going from capital to capital and trying to find out what are we willing to say together, what are we not willing to say together. It set up relationships and a framework that allowed both the US and the EU to respond much more quickly than they might have been able to the Ukraine situation. So just interesting to think about summits are not just the outputs, right? They're sort of institutionalizing a conversation and creating relationships between human beings on each side of the border or borders. I thought was a fascinating experience.
I mean, I think it's a great example that you're using. It is that those conversations forge relationships that you draw on in many different ways and unexpected ways. And just that sort of coherence around the principles, understanding how we're all thinking about this issue, what are the solutions and the sort of domestic ways we're thinking about trying to address risks are just really important of that sort of ongoing learning and partnership that through the summit we're trying to support.
I think, Linda, maybe come to you next. Can you just respond on some of that? What do you think the value of the summit for some of the countries that up until now have not been as much a part of the conversation will be? How do you think some of the governments that you've worked with in the African context, or what do you think they'll be taking away from this week?
I think one of the issues you raised about the UK, I think it's a good middle ground because many of the events and convenings that we have, the conversation is centered on 3 major powers. And so suddenly there's a shift, which I think is important. And I think the UK was best placed to have this conversation, which I think is good. I also see new alliances, from what you're seeing, who is coming on stage. I think that's good for the world. And the balance is really good for the world. I was going to also just mention on the visa issue that was mentioned earlier on attracting talent. In case you didn't know, a lot of the data labeling for ChatGPT was done in Kenya by Kenya data labelers. And I think there's a great article in the Times by Billy just talking about how much they were paid in the process. And we see how labor is exploited, in the build-up to artificial intelligence. And so to talk about, visas and to see how do you attract this particular talent, I think that really offers hope for the rest of the world that if they weren't going to a country that pays them or remunerates them well, they're going to issues like we've seen countries such as Nigeria grappling with cybersecurity and what to do with talent that really is not hired. What do you do with it? I'd also just want to mention that there's a great opportunity to build up from what's happening at OECD that you've mentioned on G7, to really go to the country level and come up with key takeaways and key laws that we could have in. One of the challenges that we've seen, especially for Africa, is to regulate the people rather than the technology. and to look at it in form of, rather than offer incentives for innovation, is to put these guardrails first, but not really noticing. For example, the data governance conversation in Europe is maybe 40, 50 years old, but in Africa it's less than 20 years old. But then Africa takes the approach that we are going to jail you, we are going to do this and this to you, yet you're supposed to, at that particular level, incentivize until we get to the point where Europe is, and then say we adopt GDPR. So I think it's for countries to really look at what stage of development are we with AI, so that if the US is running this direction, we don't run with them. We figure out that maybe we have an infrastructural problem, maybe we have a digitization problem. How do we actually have data which is really open and accessible for people to be able to use and build up on these particular frameworks? But I also think really key is to have some model laws, which I think the UN Trade Agency has done a really good job on e-commerce model laws, and at the Lawyers Hub we're thinking about that. And we did this with digital identity in coming up with model laws for the African continent and running policy hackathons so that people really have, especially policymakers, they have a go-to approach and say, this is a draft that looks like this is for us, this is for our context, can we then build up, on that? And then finally is the question on capacity. I think there's all these conversations happening on, especially I like the Connect, AI Connect. Those are really good initiatives for policymakers. But I think we need to think about who we are in the world rather than the boxes that people have put us in. I look at life as a lawyer. I can represent anyone. Today I'm with civil society, tomorrow I'm with government. We just shift positions depending on what really works for us. And I think we need to stop looking at this AI conversation from the lens of we are big tech, we are government, we are civil society, but we are humanity. And the best use of AI for me would be, can you fix for cancer, Can we not do chemotherapy again for people like us who went through cancer treatment? Like, that's what we want. We don't want it to be about domination. Like, we want dominance. We want who's going to get there first. But really about, can we solve humanity's problem? Because people are still sleeping hungry. People don't have phones. We still have early pregnancies and early teenagehood. We can't detect crop diseases. How do we make this mainstream enough for us to have conversations as humans?
This gets to a fundamental question at the heart of this whole week. And I'd be interested in views from across the panel on this. How do we make sure that these global discussions, these important discussions on safety, don't exclusively focus on risk and sort of throw out the benefit?
Right.
What, specifically within the context of global diplomacy on this, because I think we've heard from the political level, leadership level, about the importance of making sure we capture the benefits of AI. But from the standpoint of global diplomacy, how can diplomacy help ensure that that doesn't get lost in the conversation as well? Anybody want to jump on that one?
Sure, Kevin. I think it's an essential point, Linda, and I loved how you ended your last response. I mean, when the president announced a set of voluntary commitments on leading AI companies in July, one of the commitments was that companies would develop and deploy advanced AI systems to tackle the world's greatest challenges, including cancer, actually, which is near and dear to the president's heart. And Secretary Antony Blinken, my boss, hosted an event at the UN General Assembly in September on how can we use AI to accelerate progress in tackling the Sustainable Development Goals, because I think as we certainly know, the world is not on track to meet the Sustainable Development Goals, and that's a tragedy for the world. But this technology has serious promise to accelerate progress on essentially every single one of the SDGs. And as part of that event, we invited many of the companies that are developing these advanced AI systems to present, but it was very important to us for them to bring implementers using the technology on the ground in developing countries to actually tackle these problems in concrete ways. So not just to be a sort of showcase for government affairs teams, but to actually bring implementers. And I'm glad to say that they followed through on that, and we co-convened this event with Kenya, Morocco, Singapore, Japan, and Spain, I believe. And so we were able to show the world that this technology can actually do quite a bit of good. And governments, policymakers, diplomats, we can play that convening power to bring civil society, industry, academia, the public together with countries to focus minds on how do we actually address the world's greatest challenges and to show the connection between AI and achieving those goals. To me, that's really the power of diplomacy, is when you have that kind of galvanizing moment, and then that creates the expectation of follow through. And the donor partnership announced by the U.S., UK, Kenya, and Canada is part of the follow through. And there's still a lot more work to be done, obviously, but that's the start.
Charlotte.
Yeah, I mean, the opportunities of AI, just as you say, to accelerate progress across all the SDGs is profound. So I think an important part of a civil servant's role is when you are briefing ministers, you are talking, is always being able to talk about the opportunities as well as the risks. And because that is the tension of how do you get that balance, right? How do we ensure we really harness the opportunities in a way that's safe? And I mean, in the UK, the department that I'm in, and as my role as chief scientist, I have the privilege of shaping our investments for development. So how do we use science, tech, evidence to really drive development progress? And the kind of things that we're supporting actually will do more of in partnership with scientists, innovators around developing world is things like tackling crop diseases. How do we ensure that policymakers, farmers, communities have real-time access to what's happening in the weather, and can be prepared for an extreme weather event. We have worked, the research around development of treatments, vaccines has been accelerated by AI. There are AI applications to say, how do you teach large classes of mixed ability to accelerate their learning, but also to help them do STEM, do science, where you don't have enough science teachers. Innovations to help people who have limited eyesight to see things. I mean, the applications are so big, and part of actually announcements of AI for development is to accelerate across a number of those initiatives already. And yeah, the power we have as diplomats and working in partnership is to be able to talk about that and really bring those concrete examples to life, but also try and make sure there's more resources that go behind that side of the opportunities, to support the opportunities of AI, as well as clearly having those conversations about the safety issues.
Okay, we're coming to time. So one last round robin, a rapid round robin question. Let's imagine that we're back here in another 5 or 10 years from now, and it's a very happy occasion because global diplomacy around AI is working very, very well. What does that look like in your view? What does a successful next 5 or 10 years for global AI diplomacy look like? I'm going to put you on the spot, and we'll go right down the panel to close out.
I was hoping you'd go the other way. I like the idea of being a pub down the road. There's some good ones near here. I guess, I don't know if it's 5 years, I'd love it to be 5 years, is that, we are sitting and being able to benefit from the opportunities of AI. The world, health has improved, education, we're more, the education is improved, democracy is enhanced, our individual rights are empowered, in a way that all of the opportunities and the sort of the breadth of risks that we worry about in terms of AI are just not there. That would be my sort of nirvana. I guess the big question linked to that is, I don't want to be sitting here, we're a leading AI country, that we're experiencing those benefits, but other countries around the world aren't experiencing those benefits. So I think there's an optimism of let's hope for that, but also let's pay attention and hope that those benefits are also shared. Because if they aren't equitably shared, I think we will be making and creating another set of issues that maybe it would reflect that we haven't paid enough attention to those in this summit.
Linda?
Okay. I sit on the World Economic Forum's Council on Tech Policy, and they did this exercise a week ago in Dubai and asked us to think about the future, 2040. And you have a building, you have a piece of cloth, you tell us what it is. And someone said, I'm in this piece of cloth and it's showing me what my body is like. It's showing me, it changes color when my temperature changes, all these things. And I found that so fascinating. And I said, okay, I can only dream, especially from where I come from. I would say I look forward to a world of equals, that we don't meet and think that this country is better than this country or is more powerful. I look forward to the next 10 years that makes it easy for humans to move just the way technology moves. you know, that there will be no barriers. I look forward to seeing my mom alive. She's unwell, and I'm hopeful that technology will get to this point where it fixes everyday things. My team says that Americans throw software at anything and hope that it fixes things. Even when they need to talk to someone, there's a software for it. That we will bring the humanity into the software and really hope that we solve the issues of the day. I also look forward to electricity. As we talk about climate change and everything, that parts of the world still are in darkness, they don't have electricity, that it will be affordable, that Nigerian developers don't have to move to Silicon Valley to be able to make it in life, that they can make it at the very doorstep. Thank you.
Daniel?
To me, it's strengthened public trust in democratic governments that we have successfully mitigated the risks from AI while seizing the benefits, and that we have built on this Cambrian explosion of domestic AI action and new international AI initiatives this year to actually create concrete frameworks to govern AI in a responsible way that promotes innovation and allows people from all over the world, from all socioeconomic classes to benefit from this technology.
I asked this question at the end of panels because someone asked it to me on a panel 2 years ago, and my answer was, I'll consider it a success if I think about AI safety about as often as I think of food safety when I go buy food from the supermarket. Because there's a vast global infrastructure that's out there creating a safe food system that we almost never notice and we just completely take for granted. I don't think this is ever going to be a problem that will be solved. I think it's going to take continuous work at the political level, diplomatic level, within the private sector and civil society. But I'm very grateful to our panelists for an excellent discussion. Please give a round of applause. Thank you very much for your time.